Dr. Patrick Lowe is a former chief economist with the World Trade Organization who has focused on supply chains around the world and across Asia in particular. Now a vice president of research at the Fung Global Institute, he'll be a keynote speaker at the 2013 Asian Logistics and Maritime Conference here in Hong Kong. Dr. Lowe, thanks for joining us. Well, you'll be discussing intra-Asian trade at the conference. How do you see regional trade agreements affecting the industry?
These two mega-regional agreements, the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, are really important developments for Asian trade because they're consolidating, and in some cases they're pushing the agenda forward. They're consolidating a whole network of complicated, interacting, intertwining agreements that currently exist. And they really are going to be consolidated by this. So that's good for logistics. What one has to look out for, something to be aware of, is the possibility that through their discriminatory characteristics, they will make it harder to do business in certain instances. That would be a pity, but the fact is these agreements are preferential. The other thing to be aware of in terms of these kinds of agreements is the potential for regulatory divergence. You see, they're going to be entering into lots of details about regulations, which are crucial to the logistics industry. Now, if those regulations start to diverge, it's just trouble for logistics providers. And so anything that business can do to convince the negotiators that they should minimize divergence in regulatory matters, so much the better.
Well, what do you see as the top trends emerging for intra-Asian trade? How do you see that affecting the maritime and logistics industries?
Intra-Asian trade is more than half of Asian trade. In 2000, it was only about 40%. So it's quite a strong, powerful upward trend. And in terms of this conference, I should mention another number which I think is remarkable. Trade going both ways between ASEAN countries and China has been growing at 20%. That is more than double the rate at which global trade has been growing, and it's more than double the rate at which intra-Asian trade as a whole has been growing. So this is a remarkably dynamic relationship between ASEAN and China.
What sort of impact do you see from the growth of e-commerce internationally?
For supply chain operators and all those who serve the supply chain operators, which obviously includes the logistics industry, this is dramatic because the downstream part of the supply chain could be transformed dramatically. I think it's already happening in mass consumption sectors where consumers increasingly don't want to just go to the shops. They probably don't want to just do it online. They probably want both. So if you're in that business, you've got to worry about what the appropriate mix of clicks and bricks is. And that's why there's talk about an omni-channel. And I think this is a very challenging issue for supply chain operators and a source of change for logistics suppliers.
What role do you see for services when it comes to regional and global supply chains?
That's one of the big questions that we are trying to address here at the Fung Global Institute, because services are poorly understood and relatively neglected. They are an enormous part of economic activity. We've got reasonable numbers for national production, and there we're looking at 70–80% of all economic activity is services. The trade numbers are probably around half, but that is an understatement. Services are tremendously important, and they're complex, they're difficult. We don't understand them nearly well enough, and I think that is a major item for closer attention by policymakers and by business, of course.
Well, where does Hong Kong fit into the equation? 3/4
of Hong Kong's trade is with the Asian region. 2/3 of that is with China, or 3/4 perhaps, is with China. So for Hong Kong, Asia is the story. And so it's absolutely crucial what happens in Asia. And of course for Hong Kong clearly benefits from the dynamism of the region. Hong Kong is a very services intensive economy, much higher than the global average is. So there's lots of opportunity there. I think it's interesting that Hong Kong now faces more competition in what it does in recent years, but competition's a good thing. Should improve efficiencies.
Well, as a keynote speaker at the Asian Logistics and Maritime Conference, what's a key message you hope to share with the audience?
Quite a bit of this is about the dynamism of Asian trade and what opportunities this gives rise to, particularly ASEAN and China. But I think also what I want to say something about is that until relatively recently, actually until very recently, we haven't really been thinking about trade in the way we should have been thinking about it. We've been measuring it in terms of gross flows. We should be thinking of it in terms of net flows. We should be thinking in terms of who adds the value not what the value of the total product is. So a very quick example of this would be, and this is a very well-known example, I'm sure a lot of people will have heard of it already, is the iPhone. The iPhone is putatively made in China. It enters the United States trade statistics, for example, as an export of a high-tech product from China. But in reality, up until really recently, all China has been doing is assembling the components of the iPhone. So instead of being responsible for 100% of the value, which is what the gross trade number will tell you, China is responsible for less than 5% of the value. Now that's a dramatic illustration of why we should be measuring trade in a different way. It will give us a much better feel for the degree of interdependency amongst countries. It'll give us a much better feel for the technology content of trade. It'll give us a much more accurate picture of bilateral trade balances. There's any number of reasons why we have been in error by simply fixating on gross trade flows. After all, we've always measured national income in terms of value added. Why don't we do more to get these numbers for trade? It's not easy to do, but it's very important.
Well, what do you see as the value of a gathering like this here in Hong Kong?
If there wasn't such a meeting, somebody would organize one. I think they're tremendously important in terms of exchanges of views, of information, and in this particular case also in terms of potential business opportunities. So I think it's an extremely valuable gathering.